before we get started, any questions that you guys have? Anything that's come up recently that got stumped or have a question or clarification on?
I have a question, maybe more of a how to advise a client. I have a client who's closing on his house in St. George. I'm helping him purchase up here. And he wants to be closed and pay cash before, when he purchases up here. So, I mean, he has a lender, and I keep saying, if you find a house before, let's just get you pre-qualified, pre-approved. So if you put in an offer, it's still contingent because your house hasn't sold. But he's just dragging his feet because it's like, well, I don't want to do that. I just want to pay cash when it's closed. So I'm having a hard time just having him get qualified. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for me. He understands, but he just thinks that he's done business just outside of real estate agents several times, and he's just very easygoing, and he doesn't understand, even though I've tried to help him understand. So I'm just wondering if you have some advice for me.
Sure. So question for you on that. What is if he's paying cash for it, what's the reason you want him to get qualified?
If we put in an offer before his house is contingent right now, because I mean, even though he has other investments and different things, don't we need to be conditioned, or we won't have a pre-approval that has something showing that he has cash?
Are you talking, you won't have proof of funds?
Oh, yes. Sorry. Yes, correct.
Oh, okay.
Until it closes on the 8th.
Yeah. I mean, I could see him. I mean, basically what I would do is using proof of funds as, if I was sending it to another agent, I would send him the property that he has under contract in St. George, say this is what it's going to close, and that's what I would use as a proof of funds. I probably personally wouldn't go through the hassle of getting him to qualify with a lender, because he's not going to be using a lender. And then when I write an offer, I would put it contingent on the sale of their home. And then if they wanted proof of funds, I would say the proof of funds are in the home they're selling, and I would send them that information.
Oh, perfect. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah. So I can see why he doesn't want to do that. He's like, well, that's kind of wastes his time a little bit. So that's how I would do it.
Okay. Sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. So today I wanted to cover two different things that I see happen, that I see confusion on a lot. I'm going to share. Let's see. Let me share this. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so you should see on the MLS on my this is the seller's property condition disclosure, the fun page that's 16 pages, and it used to be 6 or 7 pages. So there's two sections here I wanted to go through. One is the square footage acreage, and then the other one is this Foreign Investment in Real Estate Property Tax Act that is here. And there's always been confusion and questions on these two things. First one let's talk about is the square footage. Right here, what we're disclosing is where the source of the square footage figures used in marketing of the home and relating improvements at the property site is or are the following, check applicable boxes. So where we're getting our square footage is what we're wanting to make sure we're putting here, and we're disclosing it. I always suggest to my clients that we've got to try to find some kind of an official form, something that's official that says, hey, this is how the square footage is, because the tax records could be wrong, an appraisal could be wrong, their measurements could be wrong, all of those things, or an old MLS could be wrong as well. But what we're trying to do here is we're not telling the buyers that we are exactly right. What we're saying is this is where we're getting our information. And it doesn't relieve the buyer to not get their own. And right here, I always like the bold information, because we've always been learned that if you're texting bold, it's yelling at you. Well, in the contract, it's yelling at you as well. It says buyer is advised not to rely on seller, the seller's brokerage, or any agents of the seller's brokerage for determination regarding the square footage or acreage of the property. Okay, so right here it's saying don't rely on us for what we're giving you, but I'm going to tell you where I got it. So if I put in here county records, I pull it off the tax data, then I'm going to check the first box here, county records. I'm going to do this one, and I'm just going to say, this is where I found it. If they had an appraisal done in the last little bit, or the appraisal when they bought the property and the appraisal said a certain square footage, then I'm going to check this one. Building plans. If it's a newer home or they still have the building plans, you can check that one, or others. And you can explain what it is. So where is it coming from? Okay, the seller feels like they know how big the square footage is and they want to go measure the home. So you're going to come in here, you're going to check this box and say seller's measurements. And that's something that you want to make sure you're looking at. As a buyer's agent, when you get this, you want to see where it came from, and don't just rely on old MLS or the county records. Figure out especially if there's a discrepancy in it and it's different than homes that are in the neighborhood, you want to make sure you're looking at that. So it doesn't matter which one you choose. You can choose multiple ones. You just want to make sure you're explaining where you got it from. Does that make sense? Hopefully it makes sense.
Jason, I have a question for you. In the comments, we can put the, buyer to verify all. With this bolded type, in the seller's disclosures, do we need to put that in the MLS necessarily if it's already here?
Yeah, so we put it in there into the MLS. I don't think it's necessary to put in the MLS. I don't think it protects you more or less. It's just basically saying buyer to not rely on what I'm saying, which is actually saying this in the seller's disclosures. And we have laws in Utah that, buyers beware laws that are in place. So what we're trying to do is not from the seller's perspective. We don't want to deceive anyone, but we also aren't going to be assuming anything either. You're disclosing everything that you know. And in this particular case, the square footage is something the seller they may or may not know what it is, and then they're relying on whatever source they're checking here for that information, but it doesn't relieve the buyer. So I don't necessarily think that you need to put that on your MLS. I think agents do that just because I don't really know. I think it's just comfort level of them doing it. But the one thing I would say is if your client says, Christine, I want you to go measure my square footage, I would highly suggest not being the one that does the square footage, even though you would check the box done by a real estate agent. I just think that anytime you get involved with different things that are not necessarily your expertise, that opens us up for potential problems in the future, is if we're doing things that we shouldn't do. So hopefully that makes sense. I see that question come a lot where people are just like, hey, what should I put here? Well, just put whatever they have and disclose it. Okay. The second part of this is this Foreign Investment in Real Estate Property Tax Act. This has been around for actually a really long time. 1980, I think, is when this law was passed. And we're now seeing it more often in our contracts and they're in this disclosure. So you're going to see it in your exclusive right to sell. They're going to have to acknowledge it. And then this one has to acknowledge it for the buyer. I did a little bit of research on it just so that you can kind of understand where the potential problem could be with this. This particular one, we used to have to sign it and initial it. This one is seller warrants and represents the buyer is not a foreign person as defined in the Internal Revenue Code and its associated regulations unless checked below. So unless they are a foreign person, this box actually is going to not be checked. It used to be where you would have to check is or is not. Now this is just saying that unless it's checked, they're saying they're not. This is seller represents it is a foreign person. So here's the problem with having this is let's do a hypothetical situation. A seller is a foreign person. They disclose on there that they're not a foreign person, and they sell their property. Nobody catches that they're a foreign person. They take their proceeds and then they leave the country. Well, it creates kind of a problem, and the problem comes in the taxes that our income taxes that we're being paid for selling property and what we owe to the government. Well, the question I always ask, especially when we talk like commission and splits, does the government ever say, oh, don't worry about it, don't pay me? You ever hear the government say, oh, no, you're good, don't worry about it, oh, it's just a mistake, don't worry about it? You'll never hear that from them. And in fact, if you get a tax lien put on the property, it's the only one that jumps ahead of everything else on your title report. The tax liens get paid prior to anybody else getting paid. And so normally on your lien, on your title report, whatever order the lien is put in, that's what takes priority. So if you don't make enough money on the sell, it'll pay the first one off, then the second one off, and then everybody else below it might not get paid. Well, the tax lien actually gets put way up on the very top. They're going to get paid first. So if the seller jumps the country and takes all of their money with them, the government's not going to say, oh, darn it, we made a mistake, we're not going to pay it. What they actually do is they tack that amount onto the title. And who does that affect?
The buyer.
The buyer. Okay, so your buyer comes in and all of a sudden they get a tax lien for the amount of the profit on the seller side. So it's completely out of control for the buyer. They're going to be responsible for that. So when they go to sell the property, that money is going to come out. So ultimately the buyer loses in the situation. So it's really important that, you know, if we represent the seller and they are foreign, it's just part of the whole process. They've got to pay the taxes just like all of us have to pay the taxes. They're just collecting it up front because they don't want them to leave the country, never file taxes, and take that money with them. So it is a fair thing for all of us. We all have to pay it anyway. This is just collecting it up front. So some of the numbers just to keep in mind. So we had one, this is probably last year, I think, that came in, didn't realize that there was a certain percentage they were going to hold back, and the seller thought they were going to get all of their proceeds at closing, but the title company actually held back an amount for the taxes. And the amount that is on the IRS website right now is an individual filer for taxes. They're going to hold 15% of that money back. So if you're talking about, you know, a $300,000 profit on the home, and they're doing 15% back, they could hold up to $45,000 back from the seller. And that might be a little bit of a shock to the seller that, oh, wait, I'm not going to get that money right at the moment. If it's a corporation, they're going to hold 21% back. So if your seller owns the property in a corporation and they are a foreign person, they'll hold more money back on that. Then the question that I had once that I looked up as well is what happens if you have a husband and a wife, and the husband is a U.S. citizen and the wife is a foreigner? What do they do in that situation? In that situation, they look at the proceeds of the sell and they divide it 50%, and they'll take 15% of 50% and hold it back for the other spouse. So just keep in mind that if that does come up, having a conversation with your sellers about the title company withholding some of the taxes for that is most likely going to happen, and they just need to realize that there's nothing they can really do. But I can tell you that having that conversation at the closing table when they're actually looking to get their money is a lot more stressful than if you have that conversation prior to you actually getting there. So
Jason,
uh-huh.
Jason, I've never encountered this, but what if the seller is not being truthful and they're lying about it and we think everything is fine and clear? What happens then?
So that's where, I mean, that's obviously that's fraud. Seller can get in a lot of trouble, especially when they're trying to defraud the government on that. Our job as agents is that we've got to get these things signed. We've got to ask the questions. Title does the same thing. So, I mean, ultimately, that's going to be what the buyer is going to have to fight if there was fraud in that situation. And I think fraud is handled differently than, oh, they just left and they're not paying it. There still probably would be some liability, but if we don't ask the questions, then the liability will come back on the title company, will come back on the agents in that circumstance.
So when you say that we don't ask the questions, that's verbal. So we really need to put it in writing through an email or something. I just don't want to get involved with this. And I deal with a lot of different types of people. So I am thinking, we know verbal is nothing. So it's almost in writing.
Yeah,
But do our sellers disclosures where it talks about that, does that cover us?
Yeah, the seller's disclosures covers us. And remember, if we're representing the seller in our exclusive right to sell, it covers that as well. So it's just not one of those sections you want to just skip over. You don't, you're not here, sign the exclusive right to sell. You want to make sure that you're asking those questions, and not in a sense of like, hey, I'm judging you, you look like a person from outside of the US, but more in the sense of, don't just go over this section, say foreign investment property. Are you or anyone that's an owner of this property a foreign non-US resident? And just move through it like that. It's not the disclosures are in place in writing already.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions on these two? Okay, those were the two that I wanted to talk about today, because I find that these are the ones that I get the most questions for. This foreign investment one is now simpler because we used to have to sign it and initial it. Now it's just acknowledging it. Remember that for the seller, I always like to read these big print for them. Seller understands and agrees that seller will update this disclosure form if any information contained herein becomes inaccurate or incorrect in any way. If I need to fix this, there's an addendum to the seller's property disclosure, and you can fix each one of the items that happen. Okay, so this form is getting longer because more and more people are having more and more questions that are they're not disclosing. This is to give your seller an idea of, hey, should I be disclosing certain things? The answer is always going to be, if they ask you, the answer is yes, disclose it. You're never going to have a problem with disclosing. You'll have more problem with saying not disclosing than you will disclosing. Okay, any other questions on that? Okay, any other questions regarding any other topic while I have you guys? Okay, long weekend. If you have any questions, reach out. Go put some deals together.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Thank you.